I'm recording this video to recommend this book. The book is Freud, A Very Short Introduction by Anthony Storr. Despite my general skepticism about these books, these very short introductions, this is a book that I would recommend. Freud's own writing is approachable. Freud is not a difficult writer himself, but there are reasons to consult secondary literature, including this short book, short and sweet book. So Freud's own writing is a massive body of work. It would be therefore useful to have a general short overview to know where things are. Also, this book provides a broader context of Freud's life and work. It also informs the reader about the limitations of Freud's work. And by limitation, I don't just mean the errors in Freud's work, in Freud's judgment, but limitations in the sense of constraints. Limits in the sense of, imagine that you have to do some research or some theoretical work, but you have to do it within certain limits, in accordance with certain rules. For example, your theory has to be compatible with Darwinism or Darwinian evolutionary theory, or kind of physical chemical reductionism, in the sense of grounding all psychological phenomena in physiology. Understanding these kinds of rules, these kinds of limitations and constraints helps us understand, for example, the role of sexuality in Freud's theories. Because sexuality is something that you can pinpoint, you can clearly identify as a biological, physical, anatomical phenomenon. This book also traces the evolution of Freud's own work in some cases, in the case of some concepts, and some of the ways in which he changed his minds over the years. And finally, this book provides a very helpful comparison between Freudian psychoanalysis and later psychoanalytic theories. Anthony Storr, the author of this nice book, Storr's own life was from 1920 to 2002. Storr was an English psychoanalyst and an author. He has several books on psychology, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and he has written about Freud and Jung. And I suspect, I'm not sure about this, but I think one of the reasons this book is a remarkable and very helpful, clear book is, I think, because originally it didn't belong to this series, but that's just my guess. Anthony Storr, in this book, he doesn't look down, doesn't patronize the reader. He doesn't adopt a position of being above the reader and talking to the lay person, the lay reader. So I enjoy that aspect of it. Storr has a famous book that I've encountered on social media. I haven't read it. It is called Solitude, A Return to Self, which is on my reading list for hopefully the near future. Another one of his books is called Churchill's Black Dog. And that one is also, I haven't read. That one is about artistic creativity and the artistic process. Now let's turn to this book. Let me say a few things about it. It's a short book. You can read it in a few hours. I started and finished it today in the afternoon. The book provides a very balanced view of both the merits in Freud's work and the shortcomings. For example, chapter 2 describes the evolution of single concept that is very central in Freud's work, the concept of neurosis. What it is and where it comes from, the genesis of the origin of neurosis. This concept of neurosis itself, it wasn't fixed. It wasn't fixed from the beginning to the end of Freud's career. And that the way it changed, the way its understanding in Freud's work evolved, Freud's own understanding evolved of this concept, is very interesting and instructive. And it works against, then we understand that works against the view that neurosis was one thing for Freud throughout his entire career. The book covers major parts of Freud's theoretical system, including the structure of the psyche, methods of these three major methods: free association, dream interpretation, and working with transference, detecting, waiting for transference, and then working with it. In addition, it includes other important ideas of Freud, including the distinction between mourning and melancholia. So there are two ways of, once we lose something, there is mourning as a reaction, and there's melancholia. Mourning is a normal way to grieve the loss of something, to have a sense of loss, and that loss is experienced as something that is gone, and what is gone is outside of us. The damage is outside of the being of the person who's experiencing the loss. But melancholia is different in that the loss is now experienced as a negative damage to the person. So the person becomes excessively depressed and falls into a despair because their beliefs about themselves is damaged. So that distinction between mourning and melancholia addresses why people sometimes react to loss differently. The book also includes an overview of the psychopathology of everyday life and jokes, and discusses why all of Freud's works, his books, essays, there's almost all of them. There's something funny in them, except the one book that is about jokes. And Storr talks about why that is the least funny among Freud's books. It also talks about how Freud didn't limit himself to talking about therapy. He became more ambitious and extended his ideas to culture, art, and religion. And I also already have an exercise in that. I analyzed, if you have noticed already. If you haven't, I have a video analyzing Dan Brown's Inferno, with reference to Freud's psychoanalysis. So in that sense, psychoanalysis is a worldview, and Storr also argues that we shouldn't think about psychoanalysis as a science. When we regard psychoanalysis as a science, we start to have the wrong kinds of expectations from it, and we won't appreciate its strengths and what it can contribute, the positive things that we can contribute, because we frame our expectations wrongly if we expect it to be a science. And that was partly Freud's own mistake, to present psychoanalysis as a science. Psychoanalysis instead has to be viewed as a worldview, as a hermeneutic style of thinking, as a way of thinking about people and the human condition. Freud's devotion also is discussed. Freud's devotion to helping his patients is praised, and the idea of cure is itself examined in this book. What do I mean by examining the idea of cure? I mean, what should we expect from psychoanalytic treatment? What does it mean for someone to go to psychoanalysis and be cured? Does that mean removing the symptoms, removing anxiety, depression, neurosis, or does it mean something else? And the book hints at that the idea that it does mean something else. It can mean something else. We can still hold on to our symptoms and improve because of psychoanalytic treatment. And finally, the book compares object-relation theory and the traditional Freudian psychoanalysis. Storr writes that the move from Freudian psychoanalysis to object relation, represented by John Bowlby, and I was a little bit surprised why Melanie Klein wasn't mentioned in the book, but maybe John Bowlby is a better representative. I don't know much about object relation, but just noting that John Bowlby is treated as a representative. So the move from Freudian psychoanalysis to object relation is a shift of emphasis, according to Storr. So the emphasis from what to what? Freud describes the isolated individual when he talks about the mind and neurosis and symptoms. He talks about mostly the isolated individual, whereas object relation theory pays more attention to the relationships that we have and attachments of the individuals. Freud focused more on the individual's ability to become aware of fixations and getting unfixated in, for instance, psychosexual stages of development, whereas object relation theory emphasizes development of better relationships, or developing, gaining better relationships, and having opportunities to learning about those relationships and being able to, growing the capacity to be able to have those relationships. Related to this, Storr says that Freud, while overestimating his theoretical idea, underestimated his relationships with his patients. So he just underestimated the fact that he was there consistently caring for his patients, listening to his patients, and being a reliable source, source of emotional support for his patients. That was probably the major source of help for his patients, and not his ideas, not his psychoanalytic theories. So on the one hand, he overestimated himself when it came to his theories, but he underestimated his role as somebody who cares for others. For example, and I say this and end the video with this one example of the Wolfman, who was one of Freud's case studies. Wolfman was later interviewed, and in that interview, Wolfman says, "I disagreed with almost everything that Freud said about me, about his case, about all of his interpretations, that he thought he was wrong. And still he liked him, and he felt very warmly about him, and he regarded him as with fondness and as a fatherly figure, as somebody who showed to him that it is possible to enter into this safe relationship and have someone who cares for you." So it's very interesting how Freud himself had a biased view of his work. All right, this is a good book. As I said, short, sweet, informative, written well, and very much worth reading. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you next time.